All right, we're testing out Cyberpunk Phantom Liberty, and we're going to do it on a variety of hardware. We're starting out on the GTX 1066 GB and an i5 9600K CPU. This is now the minimum requirement GPU, although I didn't have a CPU that goes as low as the minimum requirements. And again, the system requirements for the game have been updated. Right now we're on the medium preset. It says custom because I turned off upscaling. So this is native 1080p at the medium preset. And we'll test out some other stuff as well. Running around this kind of city area, we can take a look at the raw FPS and the average FPS. I think that this is the Intel PresentMon software overlay thing here. I think the average runs over the last 10 seconds. We can also see the FPS in the 99 percentile, which means the 1% lows. And we can see that those are dipping below 30 frames per second. We are currently, for the most part, GPU limited, not CPU limited. And we can tell that by looking at the GPU busy versus the frame time graph. The GPU busy is the yellow line, and if that's gets significantly below the blue line of the frame time, then that would indicate that we were getting limited by something else in the system besides the GPU, which would normally be the CPU. Let's also try driving a little bit and see how that goes. I'm not super far into this update, but into the Phantom Liberty, but they did give me this little car thing for free. So let's get in and let's drive around a little bit. Do we want to go dash cam view, or maybe we should pop out into see a bit more of the city view? We can see as we drive around with my amazing driving skills when I'm staring at the frame rate counter that our average is definitely dipping below 30 frames per second at these 1080p medium settings. We do see a little bit of deviation between the GPU busy line and the frame time line, but they're very close. So it's possible that we're getting a few little spikes of CPU-related issues or streaming issues. But you know what? Before we try lower settings, let's go ahead and kick on upscaling. So since this is a GTX card, not an RTX card, we don't have DLSS, but we could choose between AMD's FSR or Intel's XeSS. You know what? Let's go down to the quality setting on FSR and see if that can at least keep us above that 30 FPS line. It actually seems to have given us quite a boost. The averages seem a lot better now. The 1% lows are still dipping below 30. And again, that could be more CPU or streaming or VRAM related, something like that. So we can't 100% know what's going on with that. But it looks like the averages at least are closer into the upper 30s or even the 40s range. Driving around in this city area now. So this is certainly one way we could go, but if we start some combat, why don't we see how that goes? And because sometimes holding up in combat is a little bit different than holding up just driving around the city. So let's see how we do here. And hard to fight while I'm also staring at the frame time counter, but you know, this definitely seems playable. We're certainly nowhere near a 60 FPS experience, but we are at least able to play the game at medium settings with some upscaling. And I think it'd be fun to test out the low settings. Now, to go to accurate low settings, I think we'll need to get out to the main menu, because while you're in the game, it won't accurately adjust the texture settings. I've noticed the texture settings are missing from the graphics options when you are actually in the game and not in the main menu. Generally, restarting the game is a good practice between settings as well, and I would usually do that if I was doing side-by-side comparisons, that kind of a thing. But honestly, guys, I'm a little bit time crunched on this video. So anyway, we're on low settings, low texture quality. FSR goes to auto mode when you select the low preset, unless you manually turn that off. So now, if we go ahead and jump in here, back to the same place we were at, I think, driving around. By the way, SSD-wise, the game did say it no longer officially supports hard disk drives. This PC is on a SATA SSD, so it's on an SSD, but not a super fast one. So thought I'd throw that in there as well. All right, we're at low settings, native 1080p. and kind of seeming like our performance is somewhat similar to what we were getting at the medium settings once we enabled the FSR quality upscaling. Feels a little more responsive to me, but the 1% lows do still have some dips, it looks like. Let's go ahead and call the vehicle again and see how that goes. Where's my car? Here's my car. Hop in the car. Get in. Okay. By the way, you can, shoot guns in vehicles now, and all that. I think I can draw a weapon with Alt, and it's giving me the little tooltip on how all that works. So I can actually fire at pedestrians if I feel like it out of the out of the window. So look at me go. Anyway, yeah, so it looks like we're not going to be hitting a 60 FPS experience or even close to it at 1080p low settings, at least at the native 1080p. Let's go ahead and see what happens if we kick on upscaling. Let's try FSR quality. You can tell the details are a lot more aliased in front of us now, so definitely took a hit to image quality. Performance-wise, looks like we're still mostly GPU limited rather than CPU limited, and our performance did increase. If we look at the GPU busy line, you can see a few cases where as I loaded into a new area, it seemed like our performance dip was a bit CPU limited, and then it kind of stabilizes and goes back to a GPU limited performance. Anyway, it looks like, yeah, still definitely not hitting a 60 FPS experience. Let's try just pushing performance upscaling, so this is going to look quite blurry. But I'm just curious what sort of performance we could hit if you were just like, I don't care what the game looks like, I want 60 frames per second, can I do it? It's looking like the answer is no. It looks like we're closer to 50 frames per second driving around here. It's not that we never go over 60 frames per second, it's just the average is certainly below that, and the 1% lows, which could be somewhat, again, not entirely GPU related, could also be system related. I like that you can kind of jump out of the cars a little bit better now. Get into some combat here. I should actually maybe aim instead of staring at the frame rate counter, who knows. Toss some grenades in here maybe. What's my grenade button? Yeah, so it looks like the game is absolutely playable on the 1060, but you're definitely not locking a 60 frames per second lock or anything like that. Hey, back off, bro. Anyway, I think it would be fun to test out some other hardware. All right, we've now popped in the GTX 1070, and we are at the medium settings. Let me double check that for you, 1080p. Again, it says custom because I turned off upscaling. This is native 1080p medium settings for you right there. Basically just the graphics preset, but then with the upscaling turned off. And when I stare at the frame rate counter, I don't drive very well. Not that I drive that well when I am looking at the road, at least in this game. But anyway, looking like 1080p medium on the GTX 1070 is getting us kind of driving around in the 30 to 40 FPS range. And maybe I should stop driving around because I seem to be failing that. Why don't we get into some combat and see how that goes? Let's just toss some grenades at the people and see what happens. So yeah, certainly looks like, you know, frame rates in the 30 to 40 FPS range if we don't upscale. What if we did upscale? So we are going to go ahead and kick on FSR quality. So FSR quality 1080p medium. Looks like as it stabilizes, we're now 50s or so. Still not a 60 FPS line. Still hard to aim while I'm staring at the frames. Looks like occasionally there's spikes of not being GPU limited, but for the most part we were GPU limited. And while we're flatlined, why don't we go ahead and take a look at what if we went down to the low preset. This will leave the textures at medium though, since I'm not quitting back to the menu, but I'm gonna go back to native resolution. We can go ahead and scan real quickly here. And we're gonna go ahead and load last checkpoint, because that should probably load in pretty quickly. Again, we're still on the i5-9600K based system because I think that's more like the system that people might actually have with a card like the 1070. Let's go ahead and pop out. So this is now low settings, 1080p, no upscaling, but like I said, I'm pretty sure the textures have probably remained at medium. But we do have an 8GB card here, so that should be plenty for medium textures. Looks like driving around, we were kind of in the 40s. Let's go ahead and toss some grenades in here and get things fired up a little bit in the combat. Yeah, it looks like we're definitely not 60 FPS in this combat either, although kind of can get up into the 50s. If we go ahead and upscale at the quality settings, so low settings, 1080p FSR quality, let's see if as it stabilizes here, if we're closer to that 60 FPS mark. You know, at this point, we are around 60 FPS, we still have dips, and again, some of those dips could very well even be CPU related. I'm looking at the frame time graph rather than my aim, and I am noticing occasionally the frame time, the GPU busy line is a bit under the frame time line when you look at the averages, so it is certainly possible, like I said, some CPU limitation could be happening here, but we're at least around a 60 FPS experience. And I think the next hardware change I'm going to make is we're going to test out the limits of the i5-9600K by putting in a ridiculously powerful GPU for this system to get to what the CPU limits are. All right, this is what CPU limited performance looks like on the frame time versus GPU busy graph. Do you guys see that the yellow line, the GPU busy line, is significantly below the blue frame time line? Which means that the GPU calculates its part of the job to render the next frame, and then is waiting a long time for the rest of the system, which would primarily be the CPU, to do its job and calculate the rest of the frame. Notice that we are below 60 frames per second. So basically, do not take this to be the 4070 Ti performance, which is the GPU I put in the system. Take this to be the limits of the i5-9600K in this area of the game. So you can certainly see that in some areas, like over here, I'm getting over 70 frames per second. But as we were in that more populated area of the city, we definitely saw frame rate go down, and it's definitely CPU limited performance. So again, as I get into this area, we can see that I crash because I'm staring at my frame rate. But yeah, we can definitely see that in here I'm dropping now into the 40s, the 50s, 40s, that kind of stuff. And by the way, these aren't even the settings cranked. This is actually the game at the low preset, pretty much. So, and including crowd density at low. So this is really about as good as it's going to get on an i5-9600K. You are just not going to be able to lock 60 frames per second in every scene of the game, although in some scenes of the game, you certainly will. And again, to be clear, because people get confused by this is not the 4070 Ti performance. This is the limits of the CPU we have in the system while we're testing intentionally reaching CPU limited performance. Anyway, let's go ahead and pop in a different CPU. All right, I put the 4070 Ti into another system. This one has a Ryzen 5 5600X, which is a 6-core, 12-thread CPU from just a couple of years ago. Also, not a completely unreasonable one that somebody might have even paired with the 4070 Ti. And we're at 1080p, but I did bump it up to the Ultra settings, but no ray tracing on, and then turned it to native 1080p, no upscaling. So you can see the settings here. So things like the crowd density being up and a few other settings are probably increasing the CPU workload compared to what we were trying out on the i5-9600K. So do keep that in mind if you were trying to do a direct comparison between the two. And we are definitely CPU limited. Once again, if you look at the GPU busy yellow line, it is definitely below the overall frame time. So we are seeing CPU limitation, or at least not GPU limitation, something within the whole system here. And interestingly enough, we are not holding over 60 frames per second. So it is looking like the Ryzen 5 5600 is not going to give a locked 60 FPS experience driving through the city at ultra settings. Now, generally ray tracing, in addition to increasing CPU workload, also increases, increasing GPU workload, it also increases CPU workload. So I am actually curious if we move up to RT Ultra, and for now we'll try native, but we'll see whether or not we end up getting GPU limited or not. I'm just curious if we'll be CPU limited at an even lower frame rate, enabling the ultra ray tracing. Looking like our GPU busy line and our CPU busy line were closer together there for a bit, but actually they seem to be separating now that we're driving around around the city a little bit. It is really hard to drive while I'm staring at that frame timeline, but yeah, it does look like we're seeing CPU limited performance here, not GPU limited performance. And we're only able to get into the mid-40s, mid-30s. Now again, this is driving around in the city area, which is intentionally going to be stressful for the CPU. There's a ton of NPC characters, like in this area right over here. So the CPU is having to deal with all of that. But again, yeah, looking like the 5600, which is not a bad gaming CPU, is certainly struggling here. Kicking on normal upscaling, like DLSS Super Resolution, will not really do anything to improve this. I can emphasize that by going to performance mode, or at least we could test that. So this is now rendering at an extremely low internal resolution, and you see that our frame rates are still about the same. We're in the 40s, because again, in decreasing the render resolution with DLSS Super Resolution does not reduce the CPU burden to any meaningful degree. It reduces the GPU burden. So we can see that here we are still in the mid-40s despite all of that. Now, if you are on a 40 series card, DLSS frame generation could be used to try to improve the frame rate when CPU limited. So here we're not even going to upscale with super resolution. We're going to just kick on frame generation and show that, man, this thing really wants to kick on. You really have to fight the menu settings in Cyberpunk to make sure they actually stick. It's really frustrating, and I had hoped they would have fixed that. But here you can now see that our frame rates are up quite a bit. We're into the, looks like we are still dropping into the 60s at times here, but is at least keeping us over 60 frames per second. And driving through this area here, now I'm into the 80s and all that. But do keep in mind that the frame generation doesn't improve the responsiveness of the game. It does improve the motion fluidity of the game in a situation where we really had not a lot of options. You know, like I said, normal upscaling wasn't really improving the situation or anything like that. So frame generation can help out when CPU limited, at least to increase the fluidity of the game. So that's fun to test out. Now, just for fun, I guess, before we leave this CPU entirely, why don't we go into RT Overdrive mode? Again, we're only at 1080p resolution right now. We'll go DLSS quality with ray reconstruction on and no frame generation yet. I'm curious what the CPU is capable of in the path tracing mode, which is what we're looking at here. It does look like we are, for the most part, not GPU limited, despite the fact that we are path tracing. It looks like the yellow GPU busy line is beneath the overall frame timeline. So we are capable of kind of in the 40-ish FPS range on the CPU. But again, we are mostly CPU limited, at least in this scene. Kicking on frame generation then, trying to get that to stick to quality setting on that there. Sticking to frame generation, and we are able to get up into the 90s here in this particular scene, 100. When you're CPU limited, frame generation does generally double the frame rate, or at least close to it. When you're GPU limited, it doesn't quite double, it still gives a boost, but yeah, CPU limited scenes are the most impactful use case of frame generation. Anyway, So that was kind of fun to test out, but again, I think what I want to do now is test out the limits of, well, I'll move to my high-end CPU system so we can look at the CPU limitations there, as well as then test out GPUs without any CPU limitation. All right, so I popped in the 7800X3D system and I put in a RTX 4090 to make sure that we could reach a CPU limit. And it looks like at 1080p Ultra, we're able to hold around 100 frames per second most of the time. There are situations where, you know, there's a lot going on the screen where it does dip a bit below that. And our yellow line does indicate that our GPU is waiting on the rest of the system. So that's where we're at here, and this is a system with 32 gigabytes of DDR5 6000 CL30 memory. However, I noticed some weird scaling as the resolution increased. Watch this. So I'm going to go to 1440p, and I think this was still pretty normal. Again, our frame rates are going to stay pretty similar to what we were seeing at 1080p, because as the resolution increases, it doesn't seem to increase the burden on the CPU. That's pretty normal. Although we are reaching a little bit lower frame rates here, but still around 100 driving through this area, that type of thing. However, when we hit 4K resolution, I was surprised by what I saw with the yellow line, and I even did some testing off camera to try to pinpoint what the heck's going on here. So watch as I drive. So here our frame rates are definitely going below 60 frames per second as we drive through this area, and it looks though, if you look at the GPU busy line, that we are not GPU limited. Now, it does not necessarily mean that we are CPU limited. It means that the GPU is waiting for something else in the system, which I thought was really interesting. Notice that we're kind of averaging in the mid-50s here as I drive around the circle. But watch what happens when I stop driving around. Notice that our frame rates are going way up. I'm in the mid-70s now, and also notice that the GPU busy line is catching up to the frame time line, especially if you look at the average. But watch as I start driving again, our frame rates go down, and the GPU busy line is indicating that it is waiting on something else in the system. Now, I'm not a game dev, I'm not a expert on exactly what could be going on here, so my guess is, though, that as I'm moving quickly, the GPU is waiting on some kind of streaming process. So as it streams stuff in, the GPU is kind of having to wait for that process to take place, and then when I stop moving, it's not having to stream in as much stuff, and the GPU busy line again catches up closer to that frame time line. So it seems like that this is happening most at 4K resolution, so I think maybe having to stream in all of the 4K stuff is putting a burden on the rest of the system. Again, this does have pretty fast RAM. It's DDR5 6000 CL30 memory, 32 gigabytes of it. So anyway, I just thought that that was interesting. Now, if you do lower the internal resolution using something like DLSS, so we could go up to maybe DLSS quality at 4K resolution, which still looks quite good. Now we're gonna see that I think our frame rate will be a bit better here as we go through this area. Although the GPU busy line is still below the frame time line as we're kind of going around here, but the overall frame rate is averaging more into the 70s rather than the 50s, so that it does seem to ease the burden to lower that internal rendering resolution with the upscaling technology. But I just thought this was overall just an interesting result, something going on there with the native 1440p rendering. Anyway, I figure since we have the RTX 4090 in here, maybe we'll test out some stuff. How about we try out Ray Trace Ultra? First, we'll try at 4K resolution with no upscaling. So this is 4K Ultra. And looks like we're around 40 FPS or so. Once again, the GPU busy line sometimes dipping below the frame time line, although I think this is difficult on both the GPU as well as whatever was bottlenecking the rest of the system. So RT Ultra, pretty difficult here. However, we could go ahead and kick on DLSS quality, which at 4K resolution is going to look quite good. And looks like we are now over 60 frames per second, or around 60 frames per second, RT Ultra DLSS quality. And if I'm on a 40 series GPU, if I can get to around 60 frames per second, I'm generally, without frame generation, I'm generally pretty happy with frame generation's responsiveness. And if we then kick that on, looks like we're now well over the 120-ish FPS line much of the time. So, yeah, this would definitely be one good way to play the game. However, again, we do have the RT Overdrive mode to play around with. And if I go DLSS quality, and this enables the new ray reconstruction, which looks quite good. So DLSS quality, ray reconstruction. First, we'll try with frame generation off. Look at what kind of baseline frame rate we're getting. And yeah, this is quite demanding. Even with DLSS quality, it looks like we're around 40-ish FPS, something like that. If we go ahead and kick on DLSS to the balanced mode, lowering the internal resolution a bit further, we're now closer to 50-ish FPS, something like that, as we go through this difficult city area. We're approaching a point where frame generation might be responsive enough for a lot of people. If we do go ahead and kick that on, frame generation, DLSS balanced, fighting the menu to actually apply the settings that I want. Let's go ahead and see where we're at. It looks like 80-ish FPS. Again, I would prefer a higher base frame rate when kicking on frame generation myself, but this is certainly going to be usable for a lot of people. Let's go ahead and play with some other settings. Maybe we're on a 1440p monitor. So at 1440p, let's try DLSS quality frame generation off, see where that gets us. We're leaving ray reconstruction on. I've done a whole video comparing ray reconstruction, and overall, while you can find places where it does look slightly worse in certain situations, overall it is definitely a net benefit to the image quality in the path tracing mode. And here it looks like we're able to hit up into the 70s. Let's drive a little bit further on in here. But yeah, it's looking like overall base frame rates are quite good at 1440p DLSS quality. As long as we're usually around 60 FPS or above, that's where I feel very good kicking on frame generation. And if we do that, we're gonna get a very high refresh rate and quite good looking path traced experience here. This is looking like we're, yeah, gonna be well over 100 frames per second. By the way, these are the settings I've been using to actually play the game, although I've been doing it on an ultra-wide 1440p monitor, so overall frame rates have been closer to 100 rather than 120. And again, not every area is quite as demanding as what we're seeing here. All right, that's the RTX 4090. I think we should go ahead and try out some other graphics cards, but we'll leave in the 7800X 3D CPU to avoid as much CPU limitation as possible and to be focusing on the GPU limited performance. All right, we're on the RTX 3060. Again, we're on the high-end CPU, so that's not going to cause a limit. And then we're at 1080p, and it says custom because I turned off upscaling, but this is the high preset to start out at. And let's go ahead and give it a little whirl around town. Looks like we're around the 60 FPS mark at 1080p high settings with no upscaling, at least in this scene. And we'll drive around here a little bit more, take a look down this way, because again, different areas can get more demanding. But yeah, looking like 60-ish FPS, looks like dropping into the mid-50s a bit at times at the high preset. So to get more FPS, one option would be to kick on DLSS. 1080p, I don't absolutely love it, but let's go ahead and see what that does for our frame rate. Looks like we're up into the 70s now, even into the 80s at times, so certainly does something for our frames. But again, we could go the other route and kick up the visual quality. So why don't we go ahead and try out the Ultra preset. So Ultra, no upscaling. Let's see how we do. It settles in here a little bit. Yeah, kind of in the 50s. So again, if you're on a variable refresh rate display, this could be fine, but might be looking for more frames. So yeah, I think high and high with DLSS might be a better way to go. We could check out how DLSS quality does at the Ultra preset. Get us some comparison. Yeah, it looks like we're up in the 70s now. Let's see how we do when we're driving a little bit faster through here. Down to around 60 or so as we pass through that area. All right, that's 1080p. Why don't we see how we do at 1440p before we switch to another GPU? So going up to 1440p. And again, right now we're at Ultra with DLSS quality and at 1440p now. Let's see how we do. Look like we're kind of in the 40s or so. So, I mean, obviously you could go more aggressive on DLSS, but another reasonable thing to do would be to go down to high settings rather than Ultra settings. Let's go high 1440p, no upscaling. Let's see how it settles in here. Yeah, looks to be in the 40s. And if we do kick on the upscaling, DLSS quality, we are now, giving it a minute here, around 60. Yeah, pretty close to 60. So it looks like 1440p high DLSS quality offers pretty good experience. And obviously if you want a higher refresh rate experience, you could turn down settings or use upscaling more aggressively. Let's go ahead and test out some other GPUs. All right, we're on the RTX 3070. Looks like we're around, in the 70s, but this is at 1080p still. We could take a quick look at that. 1080p, and this is the Ultra preset, but with upscaling turned off. So native 1080p Ultra, no ray tracing. Seems like the 3070 is gonna be doing a pretty good job here. But I think most people who bought a 3070 were buying it more as a 1440p graphics card. So why don't we go ahead and move to that resolution. So 1440p on the RTX 3070. Again, this is the Ultra preset. Let's see how it settles in here. Looks like we're actually down into the 40s, cruising through the city a bit here. 50s now. And let's go ahead and see what we could do. So one option would obviously be to kick on DLSS, which at 1440p DLSS quality will look pretty good. And looks like that's getting us to right around 60 FPS driving down this track. And another option would be to go down to the, not the RT Overdrive mode. I mean, maybe we could test that out for a second. But again, another option would be the high settings. Again, turning off the upscaling that it automatically kicks on as part of the preset, which I find really annoying. But anyway, looks like 1440p high. Oh man, people are shooting at me. Okay, we've got some gun battles affecting our test, but that's fine. Looks like at the high settings, 1440p, we are around 60 frames per second. And then I think if we wanted a bit of an extra boost, DLSS quality would probably be a good way to go. And let's see how we do. Yeah, looks like now we're kind of up into the 70s, 80s even at times. And again, this is driving around, which can be a lot more demanding than much of the other scenes in the game. So there you go. And I think it might be fun on a card like this to maybe take a look at some of the ray tracing options. We could do RT Ultra at 1440p DLSS quality. See how it goes. Give it a second to kind of settle in. Ooh, not looking too great. We're in the 30-something FPS range. Climbing into the mid-30s. Got some enemies to run over here. Ooh, looks like our GPU busy line's going down a bit, though. I think the police chase on top of the ray tracing, are we actually hitting some kind of streaming AI CPU limitation of some kind? Interesting. I'm going to hop out and fight a little bit, just get some action into the video. Anyway, I guess I could have done some vehicle combat, but we didn't, so here you go. All right, so... yeah, it looks like 1440p RT Ultra, even with DLSS at quality, is a bit much. We could go all the way down to DLSS performance, but I don't think that looks too amazing at 1440p. Also looks like we are still not hitting 60 FPS, even at these settings. So, yeah, that's a bit rough. All right, is that enough for the, should we try out maybe 1080p on the RT Ultra? See how that goes before we try another GPU. 1080p RT Ultra. Are we still on DLSS performance and not hitting 60 FPS? That's a bit of a shame. All right, but anyway, at least getting kind of close to it. Yeah, that's still DLSS performance. And, well, performance is less than stellar, although it's perfectly playable, but DLSS performance at 1440p to me. Actually, wait, this is 1080p. Yeah, not great. Anyway, let's try some other GPUs, maybe the 3080. All right, we're on the RTX 3080. I have the 12GB version, and we are at 1440p Ultra with no upscaling. We could also look at 1080p maybe, but I think most people on a 3080 have at least a 1440p monitor and possibly 4K, so we might look at that a bit too. Looks like we are around 60 or above at 1440p Ultra for the most part here, driving through that pretty demanding area of the city. And of course we can do a lot better here, up into the 70s a bit now, again, depending on the scene of the game. And let's go ahead and test out some other stuff then. So again, like I said, we're 1440p. This was the Ultra preset, but with upscaling turned off, we could turn DLSS quality on. See what that does for us. Looks like that's kind of boosted us up into the 90-ish FPS range. Honestly, when I'm playing a first-person shooter game, that's where I'd like to be for responsiveness and just generally feels smooth to aim and looks good and all that. Anyway, yeah, it looks pretty good there. I think those would be pretty good settings to play at. What if we wanted to try to do some ray tracing? So if we wanted to go up to RT Ultra, not RT Overdrive just yet, RT Ultra, I have a feeling we'll want to be at least on DLSS quality. So DLSS quality, RT Ultra. Let's see how we do on the 3080. The 3070 was not really doing it. I'm wondering how much of that was VRAM related though, because notice that the GPU memory used right now is being reported as around 9 gigabytes or so, over 9 gigabytes. And so the 3070, which only had 8, I think was at least partially suffering from some VRAM related issues, although also just the performance level of the GPU. RT Ultra is pretty demanding here. It looks like the 3080 though, with DLSS quality on, is at least near 60 FPS, although frequently dipping into the 50s. Definitely a way you could consider playing the game though, depending on what kind of frame rate targets you are looking for. Could try going down to DLSS balanced. 1440p, I personally like to stay at quality or native, but that did look like it got us up over the 60 mark a little bit more consistently, so definitely one way to go if you want to keep the ray tracing effects enabled. Now, if you wanted to go into the full-on path tracing mode, I don't think the 3080 is going to give us the experience we're looking for. I can go all the way down to DLSS performance with ray reconstruction on and see what we get. 30-ish FPS. Let's see if it stabilizes at all. I think it takes a little while to kick in. Okay, yeah, actually now we're kind of more up into the mid-40s. More playable, but DLSS performance at 1440p, not really ideal. Something you could at least play around with maybe for screenshots. Let's try DLSS quality. Again, RT Overdrive mode, DLSS quality 1440p. And yeah, looks like the mid-30s driving through here, dropping into the lower 30s, some dips into the 20s. Not going to be an amazing experience, but thought we'd test it out. Now, if we wanted to use the 3080 at 4K resolution, I don't think it'll be using RT Overdrive mode. Let's just try out, I don't know, the high preset with no upscaling first, just to get an idea where we fall. I have a feeling we'll need some upscaling as well. So we're at 4K high settings. Looks like we're kind of in the mid-40s. And try not to start a firefight running over the people here. Go on to DLSS quality. So we're DLSS quality, which at 4K I think is not quite free performance from an image quality standpoint, but close enough that you'd probably want to kick it on. Anyway, looks like that does boost us up into the 60s. So yeah, it looks like high settings DLSS quality will be a very reasonable way to play the game on the 3080. But obviously you could turn down more or upscale more aggressively if you're shooting for a higher frame rate target. Let's try out some more GPUs. I don't think we'll do the 3090, just add on, you know, 10 or 15% to what we got here. Let's try out some 40 series. All right, we're on to the RTX 4060. We're back down to 1080p, which I think is the most likely target resolution for this GPU. And we are currently looking at the high settings, not ultra. And this is the native resolution here. And it's looking like we're good for about, 60 to 70 FPS range most of the time here, it's looking like. I'll try not to hit traffic while I stare at my frame rate counter. And again, there's the 1080p, and as you can see, high settings without upscaling. We could try going up to the Ultra preset, not RT Overdrive. Let's try just plain old Ultra, turn off the upscaling, so native 1080p Ultra, and see what kind of results that gets us. Looks like we're not going to completely lock 60 FPS at all times, but it looks like we are close to 60 FPS. Dipping into the 50s for sure at times. Now, let's go ahead and say, okay, we could kick on DLSS quality. I don't like using it at 1080p, but it's certainly a thing we could do. Let's see where it gets us. We're around mid-70s, upper 70s. This little traffic circle seems pretty rough. Going through here, we're, yeah, kind of in the 70s or so. Now, if we went ahead and did DLSS quality, but did it on the high preset rather than the ultra preset, I think we'll actually get a pretty high frame rate experience. Let's take a look. Looks like we're kind of into the 80s to 90s. Looks pretty good. Another option is to kick on the frame generation feature, since we're back to the 40 series. Now, if your base frame rate is at least around 60 frames per second, then, in my opinion, in a single-player game, frame generation will still look and feel generally quite good, and this is boosting our frame rate around 120, 130 frames per second. So you had a high refresh rate display. This would do a good job of taking advantage of the motion fluidity on offer here. Remember, it doesn't boost the responsiveness of the game, but does boost the motion smoothness. Actually, I'm curious about running it with DLSS super resolution turned off, but using then frame generation for that increased motion fluidity, because we were getting a decent base frame rate without having to upscale. This way you don't lose any image quality to the super resolution, although frame generation itself can have some image quality artifacting. Again, the higher your base frame rate, the better it tends to look and feel. So yeah, that's certainly an interesting way we could go, and getting around 100 frames per second using frame generation, which is, yeah, pretty cool. But let's see if we could handle any kind of ray tracing ultra. I think we will need some upscaling. We'll go DLSS quality. We'll start out with frame generation off and see what kind of a base frame rate we're getting. Take a minute for the RT stuff to settle in here. Yeah, it looks like our base frame rate, even with DLSS quality at 1080p, is kind of in the 40s. Definitely can dip into the 30s. This is certainly not a frame rate where I would usually enjoy turning on frame generation due to latency and image quality reasons. So yeah, I think we'd have to go, we'll try DLSS balanced. I think we're losing too much image quality at 1080p for this to make a lot of sense here. Yeah. Still not hitting frame rates where I think kicking on FrameGen would make sense either. I mean, we could do it. It's certainly a thing we could do, but I just don't think it makes a great experience if your base frame rate's a little too low. This does boost us, you know, motion fluidity-wise over 60 FPS, but like I said, it won't feel great in my opinion. We are actually still dipping below 60 at times. All right, there's the 4060, so I think it's a little underpowered for ray tracing. I mean, we could kick on path tracing before we go just for fun. I'll go like DLSS performance with frame generation on, ray reconstruction on, see what sort of experience we can get. Yeah, even with frame generation, it's looking like we're not going to break 60 FPS. And again, using frame generation to hit 60 does not feel anything like a 60 FPS achieved without frame generation. So, all right, let's go ahead and try the 4070. Well, here's the RTX 4070. I'm going to try recording this again. It keeps crashing. None of my other GPUs I've been testing so far have crashed a single time. I will mention that this is the review code of the Phantom Liberty expansion, not the release code that's, you know, going to get out to everybody else. So I don't know if there will be any or much changes to that, but just throwing that out there. It looks like we're not staying over 60 frames per second at 1440p Ultra, which is the settings that we're looking at here. And when it keeps crashing on me is when I try to turn on DLSS. And if it crashes on me again, that's just gonna be all the testing we do on the 4070, because I've got other things to do with my time. So anyway, let's try kicking on DLSS quality. Okay, now let me try backing out of the menu. Hey, it seems to have worked this time. All right. So, looks like we're up into the 70s, 80s at times. So, DLSS certainly did seem to help out quite a bit. I want to go back to that past where we were dropping into the 40s even when we didn't have DLSS on and see if this kind of solved that problem. Because honestly, that was way lower than the performance I was expecting to get out of the 4070. Anyway, yeah, it looks like at least with DLSS quality on, we're staying up over 70 much of the time on that more difficult area. Now, let's go ahead and try out, if it will let me, I wanted to try out high settings because, like I said, I was not performing super well on Ultra, so high settings, the game's gonna crash. All right, we did crash changing settings, but I've loaded back in on 1440p high settings now, no upscaling. And I'm curious if this will handle that little stretch better than we did at ultra settings. I mean, obviously it'll be better, but let's see how much better. Because hitting through this area, we're dipping pretty low on ultra settings, but looks like at high settings, we're cruising through mostly around 70 FPS or more. So I think that this would be a pretty, seems like the high settings are going to respond a lot better, at least in this area, than the ultra settings did. And so that might be something you'd want to try out. Now, another option would be, I'm going to try kicking on frame generation, but actually without super resolution, just because, like I said, you can, we have a base frame rate of around 60 to 70, so frame generation will kick us up to around 115, looks like right here, so the 110 to 120 range. Again, the responsiveness will feel more like, 60, but you get the, which feels good though, and then you get the motion fluidity of over 100 frames per second, and again, I'm not using DLSS upscaling, so we don't get any of the image quality issues from that. However, we could also kick on DLSS quality if the game doesn't crash. And let's go ahead, and the game crashed. So that's what we'll try out on the 4070 maybe. All right, we crashed again, but I did want to load back in and try out some ray tracing. Right now we're at 1440p RT Ultra, and it looks like we're getting around 30 frames per second. So certainly not amazing, and I think we should just kick on some DLSS already. These aren't the settings we're looking for. So RT Ultra DLSS quality. Hopefully we don't crash backing out of the menu this time. All right, big boost from kicking on DLSS. We're now around 50 frames per second, so not amazing, but again, 55. This is at the point where frame generation is right on that borderline of, I think, people who are less bothered by latency, I think, are going to feel good here. People more bothered by latency would want to get a higher base frame rate before kicking it on. And that's getting us to around 90-ish frames per second, it seems like. So this would be a reasonable way to play the game for a lot of people. And we could also, if it doesn't crash, maybe try out RT Overdrive, the path tracing mode. We'll go DLSS quality, start out with frame generation off. We will leave ray reconstruction on. And give it a minute to settle in here. And I will try not to drive too terribly. Yeah, it looks like we're kind of in the 30 frames per second-ish. So definitely not the place where I would like to be kicking on frame generation. Yeah, kind of low to mid 30s most of the time it's looking like here. But you can at least play around with it. I could go down to DLSS balanced. And we're still in the 30s, more kind of upper 30s and 40s now. So yeah, not an amazing experience. If we're out of the car, maybe, how are we doing? Not ideal. Oh well, kind of in the mid 40s. You know, if you want to play around with the path tracing mode and kind of look at it and stuff, it's not at all completely unplayable or anything like that. But personally, I'd probably be targeting somewhere where I could get more like 90 FPS. We can kick on frame generation. This is lower than I would personally want to be when kicking it on, but it is certainly also messing with my settings there. We'll go DLSS balanced frame gen on, ray reconstruction on, so lots of the DLSS features going on here. And does get us over 70 FPS, so again, you might want to try it out and see how you find the frame gen feels at this level. I'm sure for a lot of people it's fine, and for other people it's not. So there we go. Let's try out some AMD GPUs. All right, I've popped in the RX 7800 XT, and we're trying out 1440p Ultra first. Now, it looks like the PresentMon software overlay I'm doing doesn't pick up the name of the GPU the way it did on the other ones. Not sure if that's a general issue or if it is because I'm on a beta driver, maybe. I did download, there's a beta driver for Phantom Liberty that is out now, and I figured it would make the most sense to use that since it is specifically for Phantom Liberty. Anyway, looks like as we're driving through here, we are staying over 60 frames per second, even in some of the hard areas where I noticed the RTX 4070 was dipping well below 60, especially as we kind of went through this area right here. I'm going to come back through again. So yeah, it is definitely looking like the 7800 XT is a much smoother 1440p Ultra experience. At least when we're not using ray tracing or upscaling. But let's go ahead and play with some of the settings here. So again, that was 1440p Ultra with no upscaling. enabled. Now, if I did want to get a higher frame rate here, I think on an AMD GPU, I would probably try going down to the high preset before I tried upscaling. But just for the sake of doing it, let's try the quality setting before we go down to high. So this will be ultra settings, 1440p, but FSR quality. I think the FSR quality is perfectly usable at 1440p, but I do just notice that a lot of things, little palm tree branches, things like that, objects in motion, do just look a little bit more pixelated, a little less detail in motion than what we get with DLSS, so I'm just less likely to use it as my number one, performance tuning step. Anyway, that's all I'm saying there, but it does look like we get a very healthy performance boost. Now going through this difficult area, we're staying around 80 frames per second a lot of the time. But like I said, I'd probably be more likely to go down to the high preset at native resolution if I was using this GPU and wanted more performance, although the ultra settings did work very well just as they were. So we could have just stayed easily at the ultra preset and been perfectly happy. Looks like going down to high does gain us quite a performance boost as well. Similar boost to what we saw by going down to ultra with the FSR quality. Looks like we're mid-70s running through that pretty difficult section of the street right there with a lot of NPCs in the area, all of that. Anyway, looking pretty good here. And so let's go ahead and take a look at what if we wanted to play at 4K resolution. So this is now 4K high settings, no upscaling. And it's looking like we're getting in kind of the 40s or so. So we would, I think, definitely want to either turn things down or kick on upscaling. Now at 4K resolution, I find FSR quality to be much, to be very, very, very usable. So here I probably do think that going down to quality upscaling at 4K. So this is 4K high settings FSR2 quality, and looks like even through this demanding section of the run right here, we are hitting at least 60 frames per second. So I think pretty good 4K settings right there. And if we were down at 1440p again, we could look at the ray tracing performance, but I don't think that's going to be the way that we'll want to play the game. If I go to RT Ultra and we go native resolution, I don't think it's going to be a good experience, but let's go ahead and find out just how bad it is. Yes, we are down into the teens, so let's go ahead and kick on some upscaling right away. Could not avoid the pedestrians. FSR quality RT Ultra looks like we're getting to around 30 frames per second. Sorry if you guys hear my kids running around playing upstairs. I'm down in the basement getting some recording in while they're kind of happily doing their thing. Anyway, yeah, so 30-ish FPS. I just don't think this is the way we're going to want to go. And FSR, I really don't want to go down below the quality setting, guys. It's just not something I think makes sense from an image quality trade-off to get in the ray tracing. So I think what might actually make more sense is if we were at the Ultra preset, and then maybe you just wanted some like ray traced reflections or something like that. So if I turn on ray tracing, but rather than using one of the presets, maybe just kick on ray traced reflections. I'm curious if we're gonna get a better experience here. Looks like we're still kind of in the mid 30s, so not an amazing experience here. Maybe if we kicked on FSR quality along with that, it would be a better experience. Looks like 50 or so, something like that. Anyway, you can certainly use like RT low, which is just sun shadows and things like that. This is very playable here, but it kind of comes at are the extra reflections worth the image quality loss from having to kick on FSR2 quality? And we're still a little bit below 60 FPS in the more demanding areas. So anyway, I think the non-ray trace performance was excellent on this GPU, and you could play around with some ray tracing compromises, but let's check out some other AMD GPUs. All right, again, the name not popping up on the software overlay, but this is the 7900 XTX, so AMD's top-end GPU. I have the AMD reference model, and we're at 1440p Ultra, and it's looking like we're in the Does dip into the 80s at times, but much of the time around 90 or even 100 frames per second. Again, depending on exactly what we're cruising through right here. And again, that is 1440p Ultra with no upscaling or anything like that. So good experience at 1440p. What if we go ahead and try out 4K resolution? So we're looking at 4K Ultra graphics with no upscaling. And let's see how we do. Driving through here, it looks like we're dipping into the 40s, kind of mid 40s, around 50 now. Do this little loop maybe a little bit. This one can be pretty tricky. Yeah, kind of into the 40s. So it's looking like 4K Ultra with no upscaling is not going to be a locked 60 FPS experience. I could try kicking on FSR2 quality. And looks like at FSR2 quality, we are going to crash into a vehicle in front of us. But as that stabilizes and I get out of that, it looks like we are now around 60 frames per second, even doing this difficult traffic loop, and definitely well over 60 FPS in scenes that aren't quite as demanding as that. I think the other way to go that might make sense would be to drop down to high settings, and we'll go upscaling off. So high preset, upscaling off, 4K resolution, and looks like this is another way to get us right around that 60 FPS mark. And let's drive down this difficult little area here, past all these NPC enemies and all that. Looks like slight dips below 60 at times, but nothing too crazy. Looks like a pretty good experience. If we also kicked on FSR2 quality, which again at 4K resolution I do think looks very good and is a very reasonable way to get some performance gain. So high settings FSR2 quality, making some people mad by running them over, and we're still around mid 80s. So this would be a pretty high refresh rate way to play the game at 4K. I think this will feel very good and still look very good. What if we wanted to do some ray tracing? I think that would be more realistic at the 1440p resolution. So 1440p. Let's try out the RT Ultra preset, but with no upscaling first to get a baseline of where we're at with that. So 1440p, RT Ultra. Let's give it a second to set in. And we are now somewhere else. Okay. Well, we're going on a little adventure now, but we're down in the 30-ish FPS range, so certainly not the experience that we were looking for. Hey, I found some stairs. While we run up those stairs, why don't we try out some upscaling? So FSR2 quality, RT Ultra at 1440p resolution. Let's see if we're doing any better here. Okay, around 60 FPS now. But again, this is running up these stairs. This is not quite apples to apples comparison with what we were doing before. Perhaps I could call my car back in. All right, so we're getting the car, and again, dropping to around 50 here, it looks like. So certainly not a locked 60 FPS experience at RT Ultra in the 7900 XTX, but this is certainly playable. It's something some people may consider, and again, this is with FSR2 at the quality setting. Personally, I don't think the performance hit and some of the image quality hit from going to FSR2 quality makes these the settings that I would particularly choose. If we went to something like RT Medium, where you get some of the ray traced lighting, none of the reflections, here again, without upscaling, we're kind of down into the 40s and such. And then if I do kick on FSR2 quality, now I think we're, again, closer to 60 FPS experience in these more demanding areas with some dips. All right, I think let's go ahead and test out some lower-end GPUs from AMD. All right, we're now on the RX 7600, so the lowest end GPU we get from AMD on this current generation, and we're at 1080p resolution at the Ultra preset, but with no upscaling enabled. and it looks like we are very close to 60 FPS, but in the more demanding areas, we can dip into the 50s or even the 40s. And that's kind of what we're looking at here. Again, difficult section that we're driving through right now, closer to, upper 40s, low 50s. So it's looking like if we did want to get a higher frame rate here, 1080p, I really would avoid FSR2 if I could just tweak normal graphics settings and stay at the normal resolution. Let's not go up to RT Overdrive. Going to the high preset, I think should be a good way to boost performance here, and let's see if that does the trick. Looks like in this area, we're right around that 60 FPS mark. Let's check if when driving back past this area again, we get the 60 FPS line or not. Again, looks like we can dip below 60, but mid 50s, if you're on a variable refresh rate screen, this is gonna feel pretty good, and that'll smooth out those little dips. Much of the time looks like we're around 60, so I think 1080p high settings will be a very good use case for this GPU. And remember, when you're not speeding through the city in a vehicle in a crowded area, a lot of times the performance will be better. Now, of course, we could go down settings or try out at least a little bit of FSR. Again, not my favorite thing at 1080p resolution. I think we get a lot of pixelation on the trees and things in motion now as objects are disoccluded and all that, but it does boost our frame rate a healthy bit. Anyway, let's go ahead and try out some 6000 series AMD GPUs. All right, here we're on the RX 6600. So this one is generally, if I'm recommending my GPU buying guides, this is hanging out around the $200 mark and tends to be one of the lowest end GPUs I'll recommend purchasing if you're buying new these days. And 1080p Ultra looks like we're hanging out in the 40s. It does dip down into the 30s at times, but again, this is 1080p Ultra. We certainly do not need to be at 1080p Ultra. So we can go ahead and go down to the high preset. So let's try out high with no upscaling first. And I think we'll get a reasonable performance bump. Looks like we're now into the 50s. Dipping into the 40s at times again, but very, very playable. Now, if we are searching for 60 frames per second, I think now our choice is to either turn down to medium settings or kick on FSR quality, or both. We can try out FSR quality here. Again, I don't love how this looks at 1080p resolution, so you can try it out, see how much it bothers you on the image quality details, but it is looking like we're boosting our performance quite a bit here. So 1080p FSR2 quality, and it's looking like we can stay above 60 FPS through these difficult areas and all that. So performance pretty good. Again, little questionable on the image quality using upscaling at 1080p here. Another option would be go down to the medium preset. I think since we're in game, not going back to menu, that is going to leave textures at high, but we're going back to the native resolution. Let's let this settle in here for a second. And so looking like 1080p medium with, like I said, I think high textures probably still kicked in. Now we are around 60 frames per second, so it is looking like 1080p medium if you don't want to upscale on the RX 6600, even in these kind of difficult driving areas, looping around this and all that, seeming to hang in there pretty well. All right, let's check out at least one more AMD GPU. All right, this is now the RX 6700 XT. I have the AMD reference model, and we're at 1080p Ultra settings. This has been a GPU I've been frequently recommending around the $300 price point for its good performance and 12 gigabytes of memory. I'm noticing, by the way, that the AMD GPUs also don't seem to be reporting their memory used correctly to this overlay, but whatever, at least we are getting the performance numbers. And it looks like we are dipping to around 60, maybe slightly below at times here as we run through the city at 1080p Ultra on the 6700 XT. Let's go ahead and try out a little more settings here. We could try going down to the high preset if we wanted to stabilize our frame rates above 60 frames per second and significantly higher in a lot of scenes. So looking like at high settings, yeah, these lower dips seem to be more into the 60s, with a lot of the time being more into the upper 70s or even 80s. Let's do one more pass down this area, which was a little bit difficult at Ultra. Yeah, now we're solidly into the 70s much of the time, with the dips being into the upper 60s. So that seems pretty good. That's 1080p. But the 6700 XT is reasonably at home at 1440p as well. So let's go ahead and give that a shot. So we're still at the high preset with no upscaling, but now we're at 1440p resolution. So 1440p high, looks like we're dipping into the mid 50s. Again, still extremely playable, especially if you're on a variable refresh rate screen. Dipping to around 50. And let's try this little traffic circle. Looks like, yeah, around 50. This is very playable at 1440p high, and again, many scenes of the game will be easier to do than driving through this area. But if we did want a bit more performance at 1440p, you can definitely look at FSR2 quality. You can still, I think, see some hit to the image quality from that upscaling, but it is giving us a nice, healthy boost to performance. Looks like here we're kind of in the 70s. Let's try to circle back around through this more difficult area in the middle of the town. But yeah, it's looking like 1440p high with FSR2 quality is going to get you more of that higher refresh rate experience. If you're looking at that, looks like this difficult area is dipping into the upper 60s, low 70s. But like we said, many of the other areas were performing significantly higher than that. I'm having driving problems, but don't blame that on the graphics card. This is simply user error. Anyway, looks like we could also test out what if we just went down to medium settings, but without upscaling. So this is 1440p medium. And let's try driving through this kind of difficult area by this building here. Yeah, it looks like we're solidly over 60 frames per second almost all the time at 1440p medium. And yeah, there we go. Should we test out an Intel Arc GPU before we go? Perhaps we should. I think we will. All right, let's take a look at the Arc A750, and this is at 1080p Ultra settings. So looking like we're actually pretty close to 60, although dipping into the 50s, but I think this next section of the test run is a little demanding. Let's see how we go. So dipping to lower 50s, and kind of mid 50s through here, lower 50s, mid 50s. Yeah, okay. So, I mean, certainly could just use these settings, especially if you're on a variable refresh rate display. But if we do want to lock into 60 frames per second, let's go ahead and try a few things out. Looks like we lost our video connection when I went to the menu for a second. Okay, we're losing it again. Well, that's interesting. But anyway, let's keep rolling. We'll go down to high settings and turn off upscaling for now. We certainly can test upscaling in a minute. Anyway, let's keep rolling. We're on kind of 60 frames per second here as we run through this area. Let's do the loop and back around and see if we can maintain 60-ish frames per second as we loop the corner here. Looking pretty dang close. Not that we don't ever drop below 60, but yeah. Honestly, looking like 1080p high looks pretty good here. Let's go ahead and take a look at a couple of other options. One option is we do have XeSS at 1.1 version here. We could go to the quality settings, see what sort of a boost we might get on that. So now we're up into the 70s. Now, well, I don't think the image quality is quite up there with what, ooh, lost my video signal again for a second. Anyway, it could just be that it's my capture card. We're on a very long HDMI cable, and I've noticed the Intel GPUs are a lot more touchy on that than my AMD and NVIDIA GPUs. But anyway, performance-wise, looking pretty good here, and I was going to say image quality-wise, I feel like XeSS, especially when running on an Arc GPU, it does look and perform better on Intel's own hardware than the version that used a DPA for fallback onto NVIDIA and AMD GPUs. Anyway, looks pretty usable here. Losing video signal again as I go to the menu and try to go to 1440p, but let's actually test out some 1440p. So we're 1440p, again, it's the high settings with XeSS quality. Let's go ahead and see how that plays out and then maybe change some things. But yeah, I think XeSS quality does look pretty good. Wow, losing video signal once again. We're kind of in the mid-50s performance-wise here. And as we wrap around this loop, we're going into, yeah, mid-50s again, lower 50s a bit. As we go by here, kind of mid-50s again. All right, so that's looking pretty good. Now we could also try out what if we were not upscaling, so if we were at native 1440p high settings. See how we do. Kind of dipping down into the 40s here. And what if we maybe tried out medium settings a little bit before we go? All right, maybe medium settings, but with upscaling turned off. Looks like we're kind of around 50. Losing video signal once again slightly. That's annoying. And we will once again pop on some, not FSR, we'll go with XeSS at the quality setting. So medium settings, XeSS quality, 1440p. I think this might have been the magic that gets us to a more stable 60 frames per second. Again, apologies for the capture issues that we're having. But anyway, performance-wise, we've got some numbers. And I think that's gonna be it for the ARC GPU testing. All right, well, sorry for the really long video. Hopefully you guys maybe just like use timestamps to pop into the part you were most interested in. A little bit of final thoughts. Again, just on making the video itself, I kind of had the choice between either do really nice, perfect side-by-side comparisons, which then would have limited the amount of time I had to test a whole bunch of graphics cards and at various settings that made sense for those GPUs, or I could do what I did here, which is just test a whole bunch of GPUs in a similar area of the game without perfect side-by-sides and editing and all that. And again, apologies for the software overlay I was playing around with this time, maybe not working perfectly on reporting the AMD hardware, but we still got the right frame rate numbers we needed anyway, so that's kind of thoughts on the video. Now, thoughts on Phantom Liberty. Overall, like I said, I originally just planned to play this until I got to an interesting spot to benchmark, and then go back to playing Baldur's Gate 3, but right now I'm actually really split. I've finished my benchmarking here, but I'm enjoying Phantom Liberty so much, I think I might end up actually finishing this and then going back to my Baldur's Gate 3 playthrough. And while a lot of it is the game itself, I think is quite good. I'm also just really, I know, spoiled YouTuber on an RTX 4090, but playing the game, I'm actually on ultra-wide 1440p, but for this video, we're looking at normal 1440p, DLSS quality, ray reconstruction on, frame generation on, and path tracing on. Is a really interesting way to play this game. The frame rates are high, the game feels responsive, and while there can be some weird little issues with both frame generation and the path tracing mode itself, this is really a next level of graphics that has just been really a treat to play around with, despite the occasional rough edges that I get, little bits of ghosting on the ray reconstruction and all that, but this has been a lot of fun to play with, and overall I like the expansion to the game quite a bit so far. I'm just a few hours in. Anyway, hope you guys found the video interesting, and I need to get some rest. That was a lot, and actually I still need to edit all of this together and upload it. So anyway, I better get going on that, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.